So it's like you might not want the exogenous ketone before your 10K, but maybe you want it after from a recovery standpoint. So it's a lot of it is like, you know, when do I take it based on what I'm going to do in terms of if you're going to get anything at all, or
Yeah, for
potentially take a
sure.
step
And
backwards.
I was thinking about that a while ago because, you know, ketones in the blood would essentially kind of like shut down or shut off like carbohydrate oxidation or utilization a little bit. So like it almost seems counterproductive if I was going to take this for a 10K
Yeah,
where I
yeah.
want to be like
Go
maximizing my
glycolytic as
carbohydrate
much as you
oxidation
can.
and
Yeah.
glycolytic. So, you know, taking that, I was like, oh, would I want to do that? Because it might like depress the amount of output that I might be able to like do during that race. So it's not that like, oh, ketones suck, but like, well, you don't want to do it before that, but before a 24-hour ultra or even like a marathon, sure, they could be good in that context. So
Yeah.
it's important to think about for sure.
Yeah, when I saw that, I was like, well, this makes sense because when I'm working with like my coaching clients, the low carb ones, if they're doing like a range of distances, it's like they're doing an ultra marathon, like, you know, they're worried about their fat oxidation rates, and they're like, if I introduce carbohydrate, is that going to be a problem? Is it going to suppress them and stuff like that? I was like, well, before the race, you probably don't want to have a lot of carbohydrate. Maybe wait until you get into it. But if you're doing a 5K, it's like, I'm not really concerned about your fat oxidation rates. I think you might want to like actually suppress those a little bit and hit the gas for those. So it's like breakfast is going to be different between a 5K versus 100 miles. So why wouldn't the exogenous ketone protocol be different? But yeah, but it'll be interesting to see what Brendan and everyone else kind of gets to with it and see where it leads, if anywhere. So
Yeah. I think the two different types though too are interesting because there's like all ketones aren't just ketones.
Right.
So we have like the two main ones pretty much now are the one that is like beta hydroxybutyrate, and then there's the butane diol. And so they're definitely different. And I think at least the beta hydroxybutyrate one, I would more lean on that towards being kind of a physical performance enhancer. The butane diol one seems to have more of the cognitive maybe or like mental effects because that one's kind of it's essentially like an alcohol. So like if you drank enough of it, you'd be like a little bit like tipsy or loopy or whatever. So it's kind of interesting to think about that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, because when you look at this, if you actually look at the products that make the difference, the esters versus the diols have less ketones in it for that reason, I would imagine, because you just can't do 30 grams of a diol without maybe having the reverse effect. Or
Yeah.
It's interesting stuff. I feel like there was another study we were going to talk about that.
Oh, the periodized carbohydrate.
Oh, yeah.
Study. Yeah. I definitely wanted to touch on that because that one was interesting, and that was kind of a case where, you know, I would say that I kind of practice a bit of like periodized carbohydrate intake. So that one was where like you read a study that goes against kind of your previously held like beliefs, and obviously one study doesn't negate like kind of like the rest of the research. But yeah, so this periodized carbohydrate study, it just recently came out, and it was in elite cyclists. I think it was like 17 of them, and they were younger, so like mid-20s or whatever. And what they essentially did was divide them into two groups. It was a 5-week study. So they did high carbohydrate group and a periodized carbohydrate group. So essentially what the periodized carbohydrate group was doing, they were doing all their lower, so zone 1, zone 2 intensity sessions. It was like a fuel for the work required approach. So like zone 1, zone 2 sessions, they were fueling with like protein and some fat beforehand, no carbohydrates, and then no carbohydrates during. So they were essentially doing kind of like a quote unquote fasted exercise type of thing. High carbohydrate group was just like using carbs before, during, after training, like for the entire time. And again, only 5 weeks, so like pretty short. But I thought what was interesting, they all improved in like their maximal lactate steady state performance. So after like the training period, they improved. But I guess one of the main findings was that the periodized carbohydrate group didn't increase their fat oxidation more than like the high carbohydrate group due to training. I guess neither one improved. I think there were like no differences in improvements in fat oxidation. So, and I don't know if you read the study or not, but like interesting. Before I even came here though, I was reading the table, and they did the fat oxidation test during their like a test to exhaustion. So like a time trial type of thing. And it was low for one, which like kind of caught me off guard. I think it was like 0.3 grams per minute or something during but it was a time to exhaustion test. So perhaps they were, pretty high intensity.
Yeah.
It was double though that of the high carbohydrate group, but it like wasn't statistically significant. So
Oh,
one of those other
interesting.
things where you're like sample size and things like
Yeah.
that might matter. But overall, basically, it was kind of just like they saw no difference, no benefits to the periodized carbohydrate approach, which one could say, oh, well, periodized carb is no better, so you can eat high carb all the time, but it was no worse also. So they maintained kind of their training output. They kind of maintained their performance or even improved their performance, similar to the high carb. So it's interesting because one of the benefits and one of the reasons why a lot of people do the periodized carbohydrate intake is for the benefit of improving their fat oxidation. And so based on the results of that study, and of course it's just one, but like that wouldn't necessarily support that it's any better. So and I think one of the reasons, though, might be they were highly trained athletes. They weren't sedentary people, or they weren't your just like average quote unquote exerciser. And I think that elite athletes are like fat burning machines already. So are you going to see a benefit with periodized carbohydrate intake? And so that was, it kind of just got me thinking one about my own training, my own like approaches, most of which is just like fasted training, and why I do it, why I tell people to do it. It kind of like changed a little bit how I think about that, but it was kind of cool to see that study. I haven't read a periodized training study kind of in a while, so this was one of the first to be published in a while.
So were they? I haven't looked at it closely, but so were they eating the same amount of carbohydrate? It was just positioning, or was there less carbohydrate?
It ended up overall being less. So I think the periodized carbohydrate group, they were eating 5.5 grams per kilogram per day.
Okay.
So they were probably around maybe 300, 350 a day. And then it wasn't a drastic difference. So like then the high carb group was 7.5, maybe 8 grams per kilogram per day. So they were more in the range of like 500 to 600.
Okay.
So it wasn't like quite double. They were probably eating 200-ish more grams of carbs per day. So maybe one of the reasons is that like carb was essentially matched, but so yeah, they were eating generally the same, I guess, but a little less.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on the workload of the participants, but yeah, you could have a scenario where enough is enough and then you don't see any difference versus, if you double the workload, now all of a sudden you do have a difference. But
yeah, the training program was pretty intense. They were doing 2 days most days. They were doing probably, I don't know what the hourly kind of like work or what their workload was. They had like, it was pretty extensive, like the tables and stuff.